A coffee order turned into a 5-year-old mystery when an overweight waitress noticed a ring and said a name that made a Chicago Mafia boss freeze mid-sentence. What came next, nobody could have predicted. Dante Walker had eaten at better tables than this one. He had sat across from senators, corporate lawyers, and men who controlled entire shipping routes along the eastern seaboard. He had negotiated deals worth more money than most people would see in 3 lifetimes. He had walked into rooms where the air itself felt dangerous and walked out without a scratch. But right now, he was sitting in a corner booth at Caruso's, a mid-sized Italian restaurant on West Randolph Street that he quietly owned through 2 separate holding companies, pretending to be a regular customer while mentally cataloging everything wrong with the place. The lighting above the bar was too dim. 2 of the table settings near the window were misaligned. The host had taken 40 seconds too long to greet a couple who walked in ahead of Dante, and the background music was playing just loud enough to be annoying without being loud enough to actually set a mood. Small things, but small things were how businesses fell apart. He had his coffee in front of him, black, no sugar, and a menu he hadn't opened. He didn't need the menu. He had written the menu. He just needed to sit here long enough to form an honest opinion about whether the floor manager was actually doing his job or just pretending to. The lunch crowd was moderate, a few business tables near the center, a family with 2 kids by the window, a woman eating alone near the back with a book propped against her water glass. Dante picked up his coffee cup. "Excuse me." He looked up. The waitress standing beside his table was a heavy-set woman in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back neatly, the restaurant's standard black apron tied around her waist. Her name tag said, Emily. She had a warm face, the kind that looked like it smiled easily even when things weren't particularly funny, and she was looking at him with an expression that was several degrees more focused than the polite attentiveness most servers managed. She was looking at his hand, specifically at the ring on his right hand. A dark steel band with a small compass engraving along the outer edge. He had picked it up at an estate auction years ago and worn it so long he barely noticed it anymore. "I'm sorry," Emily said, and she genuinely sounded like she was. "I don't mean to stare, it's just that ring. Where did you get it?" Dante set his coffee cup down slowly. "Why do you ask?" "My fiancé had one exactly like it." She paused. "Before he disappeared." The restaurant kept moving around them. Plates clinked somewhere near the kitchen. A child laughed by the window. The background music played on. Dante looked at her carefully. What was his name? "Ethan," she said. "Ethan Grant." The name landed somewhere in Dante's chest, like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. Ethan Grant. He hadn't heard that name in 5 years. He had thought about it once or twice, in the vague way you think about something unresolved that never quite went away. But hearing it spoken out loud in a restaurant he owned, by a woman he had never seen before, that was something else entirely. He kept his face neutral. Years of practice made that easy. "Sit down," he said quietly. Emily blinked. "I'm working." "I know. Sit down anyway, just for a minute." She glanced toward the floor manager's station out of habit, then pulled out the chair across from him and sat, keeping her posture straight in the way people do when they're not sure if they're doing something they're allowed to do. "Tell me about him," Dante said. She studied him for a moment. "You knew him?" "I met him once, briefly. About 5 years ago." He turned the ring on his finger slowly, a habit he had when he was thinking. "We were at the same function in downtown Chicago. He introduced himself. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. He seemed agitated, like a man trying to stay calm about something that wasn't calm at all." Emily's jaw tightened slightly. "That sounds like him, toward the end." "He disappeared 2 days before your wedding." Her eyes sharpened. "How do you know that?" "He told me about you. In those 20 minutes, he told me he was getting married in 2 days. He said your name." Dante looked at her steadily. He was not a man planning to disappear. Whatever you've been told about that, or whatever you've assumed over the years, I want you to hear that clearly. The man I spoke to was not running away from his life." Emily was very still. The color had shifted slightly in her face. Not pale, but something quieter than her usual expression, like a door opening onto a hallway she hadn't known was there.
"Then what was he running from?" she asked.
"I don't know," Dante said honestly. "He started to tell me something about a business network, documents he had found. He was going to explain further, but he got a phone call and walked away. I assumed I'd hear more later." He paused. "I never saw him again." Emily was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the lunch crowd carried on without caring. "I've been looking for 5 years, she said finally, and the steadiness in her voice made the words hit harder than if she had cried them. "Everyone told me to stop. Everyone told me he left because he wanted to. I never believed it. I just couldn't prove otherwise." Dante reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a plain business card. No name, just a phone number. He slid it across the table to her. "Call that number tonight," he said. "There may be things about Ethan's disappearance that neither of us knows yet, and I'd like to find out what they are."
Emily picked up the card and looked at it. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter to you?" Dante looked at the ring on his hand for a moment before answering. "Because I bought this ring at an estate auction 7 months after Ethan Grant vanished," he said quietly. "And I've been curious ever since whose it was before mine." Emily looked up at him. For the first time in 5 years, something in her expression looked less like grief and more like the beginning of an answer. Emily called at 9:47 that night. Dante was in his home office, halfway through a stack of financial reports, when the unknown number appeared on his phone. He answered on the second ring. She didn't waste time with small talk. That was the first thing he noticed about her. She wasn't a person who filled silence with noise. She got straight to the point, told him she had found something while going through an old box she had packed away years ago and never fully sorted through. A rental receipt. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A storage unit paid 2 years in advance under Ethan's name, dated 3 weeks before he disappeared. Dante was quiet for a moment after she finished. "You kept his things," he said. "I kept everything," Emily replied. "Everyone told me to donate it. I couldn't." "I'll pick you up at 7 tomorrow morning." She gave him her address without argument. The drive to Milwaukee took about 90 minutes. Emily sat in the passenger seat of Dante's black SUV with the rental receipt in her hand and a coffee she had brought from home in the other. She didn't ask questions about who he was or what he did for a living. He got the sense she had already looked him up and decided that whatever she found wasn't going to stop her from following this through. He respected that. They didn't talk much on the drive. Comfortable silence, which was unusual for two people who had met less than 24 hours ago. The storage facility was on the south edge of Milwaukee, a low gray building surrounded by a chain-link fence, the kind of place designed to be forgettable. The unit number on the receipt was 114, a ground floor unit at the far end of the corridor, away from everything else. The facility manager pulled up the account, confirmed the rental had lapsed 8 months ago after the prepaid period ended, and told them the contents had been flagged for auction but not yet cleared. Dante offered a straightforward arrangement to access the unit and retrieve the contents, and the manager, after a brief internal debate, accepted without much resistance. Unit 114 had a standard roll-up door that groaned when it opened. Inside, the air was stale and cool. A single overhead bulb flickered on when Emily found the pull cord. The unit was maybe 12 feet deep, not large, but it was organized in a way that told Dante something important about Ethan Grant before he even touched anything. Everything was arranged deliberately. 2 plastic storage bins stacked on the left side, clearly labeled in neat handwriting.
A folding table in the center with a cardboard box sitting on top of it, a second box on the floor beside it. No random clutter, no dumped belongings. This was not a space where someone had thrown things to hide them. This was a workspace. Whoever set this up expected to come back. Emily stood in the doorway for a moment without moving, and Dante didn't rush her. Then she stepped inside. The first bin held notebooks, 7 of them, identical black hardcovers, filled with Ethan's handwriting. Dante flipped through one carefully. Pages of notes, dates, names of companies, transaction figures, and small diagrams connecting one entity to another. The handwriting was fast but readable, the kind a person develops when they're trying to capture thoughts before they disappear. The second bin had maps, printed road maps with routes highlighted, and printed satellite images of what looked like commercial properties across several states. Someone had written coordinates in the margins. Dates, too, most of them falling within a 14-month window, about 6 years back. The cardboard box on the table held business records, printed emails, financial statements, what appeared to be internal memos from companies Dante didn't immediately recognize. Some pages had sections underlined in red. Others had question marks written beside figures that clearly didn't add up to Ethan's satisfaction. Emily was reading one of the notebooks slowly, turning pages without speaking. Dante opened the second box on the floor. Inside, sitting on top of a folded road atlas, was a sealed envelope, plain white, no stamp, written on the front in the same neat handwriting as the bin labels. "If you're reading this, I wasn't able to come back." He picked it up and held it toward Emily without a word. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set down the notebook she was holding and took the envelope carefully, the way you handle something you've been waiting for long enough that actually receiving it feels unreal. She opened it. Dante watched her read. He didn't look over her shoulder. He turned back to the business records in the box and gave her the privacy of the moment. After about 2 minutes, she made a small sound, not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and held the letter out to him. He read it. It was short, half a page. Ethan's handwriting, calm and deliberate. It said he was sorry for the silence, that what he had found was larger than he initially understood, and that moving carefully mattered more than moving fast, that he had left everything organized because he trusted that the right person would eventually find it, that the next step was not in this room. The last paragraph was a set of directions: a lake house in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, a neighbor named Paul, a loose floorboard in the hallway near the back door. No explanation of why, just the directions and one final line beneath them. "Tell her I never stopped." Emily folded the letter and held it against her chest for a moment with her eyes closed. Dante said nothing. He started carefully repacking the boxes. Whatever Ethan Grant had uncovered 5 years ago, he had built a trail. Piece by piece, location by location, he had laid out a path meant for someone patient enough to follow it all the way to the end. They loaded everything into the SUV as the morning moved toward noon. Lake Geneva was an hour south. Lake Geneva was the kind of town that looked like it belonged on a postcard someone's grandmother kept on her refrigerator. Quiet streets, old trees, lakefront properties that had been in families for generations. The kind of place where people came to slow down. And the town itself seemed to encourage that by simply refusing to move any faster than necessary. Dante drove through the main street without stopping and followed the directions from Ethan's letter toward the quieter residential edge of town, where the lake houses sat further apart from each other, separated by stretches of lawn and old wooden docks that extended out over the water. The address led them to a small gray house set back from the road, single-story, modest, the kind of rental property that existed in every lakeside town, maintained well enough to rent, but not well enough to feel like anyone truly lived there. A "for rent" sign stood near the mailbox, which told them the property was currently empty. Emily stood on the front porch and looked at the door. "He rented this under a different name," she said, more to herself than to Dante, "which means he was already being careful by the time he found this place." Means he knew someone might be looking for him, Dante said. She nodded slowly.
Then she turned and looked at the house next door, a slightly larger property, well kept, with a garden along the front that had clearly been tended by the same hands for many years. Wind chimes hung near the front door. A pair of old work boots sat on the mat outside. Someone was home. Dante knocked. The man who answered was in his mid-70s, lean and unhurried, with the kind of steady eyes that belonged to someone who had spent a lot of years paying attention to things. He looked at Dante first, then at Emily, then back at Dante. "Help you?" he said. "We're looking for information about a man who rented the house next door about 5 years ago," Dante said. "We were told you might remember him." The old man studied them both for another moment. "You'd better come in," he said. His name was Paul Greer. He had lived next to that rental property for 22 years and had seen dozens of tenants come and go without paying much attention to any of them. But Ethan, he said, was different. They sat at Paul's kitchen table with mugs of coffee that Paul made without asking if they wanted any, just set them down and settled into his chair like a man used to telling stories at his own pace. "He was here for about 6 weeks, Paul said. Kept to himself mostly, which I didn't mind. But he'd come out in the evenings and sit on the dock. After the first week, I started sitting on my dock too, and we'd talk across the water. Nothing serious at first. Weather, the town. He asked a lot of questions about the area, which businesses had been around a long time, which ones had come and gone." "Did he tell you why he was asking?" Emily said. "Not directly, but I got the sense he was building some kind of picture, like he was trying to understand how something worked from the outside before he could go any deeper into it." Paul wrapped both hands around his mug. "He wasn't hiding. That's the thing I want to be clear about. People who are hiding act a certain way. They watch the road, they flinch at cars slowing down, they don't make eye contact with neighbors. Ethan wasn't like that. He was focused, like a man with a job to do who needed a quiet place to do it." Emily was listening with the kind of stillness that meant she was absorbing every word carefully. "Did he ever mention anyone? A name? A company? Anything he was looking into?" Dante asked. Paul nodded slowly. "Once. We were talking one evening and he mentioned a name, Meridian Group. Said it like he expected me to recognize it. I didn't. But the way he said it told me it mattered a great deal to him." Dante filed the name away without reacting to it visibly. "About a week before he left," Paul continued, "a man came to see him. Arrived in a dark car, stayed about an hour, left without speaking to anyone else. Ethan was quieter after that, more careful. 2 days later, he was gone." Paul pushed back from the table and stood up with the steadiness of a man who still trusted his body. "Hold on." He left the kitchen and returned 2 minutes later holding a photograph printed on standard paper, slightly faded, the edges soft with age. He set it on the table between them. It showed 2 men standing outside the gray house next door, caught mid-conversation. Ethan was clearly recognizable. Emily made a quiet sound when she saw his face. And beside him stood a broad-shouldered man in a dark jacket, slightly turned away from the camera so his face was only partially visible. "I took that from my upstairs window," Paul said without apology. "I've always had a habit of photographing things that seem like they might matter later. In this case, I was right." Emily picked up the photograph carefully and looked at Ethan's face for a long moment. Whatever she felt, she kept it contained, but her hand wasn't entirely steady. "He looks like he's arguing with him," she said quietly. "Or warning him," Dante said. He took the photograph from her gently and studied the second man's profile. Something about the angle of the jaw, the way the man held his shoulders, Dante couldn't place it immediately, but it registered somewhere in the back of his mind as familiar. He photographed it with his phone and handed the original back to Paul. "Can we keep this?" Emily asked Paul. "It's yours," Paul said simply. "I kept it long enough." Outside, walking back to the SUV,
Emily stopped at the edge of the road and stood still for a moment, with her face turned toward the lake. The water was flat and grey under the afternoon sky. "He never intended to leave me," she said. It wasn't a question this time. "No," Dante said. "He didn't." She nodded once. Then she got into the car, and they drove toward whatever Ethan had left for them next. The photograph took 3 days to lead anywhere useful. Dante sent the image to someone he trusted with that kind of work, a woman named Clara who had spent 15 years in financial investigations before deciding she preferred working without a corporate structure above her. She was thorough, discreet, and rarely wrong. He didn't explain the full context. He just sent the image and asked her to identify the second man if she could. While they waited, Dante kept turning the name Paul had mentioned over in his mind. Meridian Group. He ran it through his own channels quietly. What came back was surface-level clean, a mid-sized business consulting network operating across 7 states, founded about 12 years ago, with a reasonable public profile and no obvious red flags in anything publicly available. The kind of company that existed in the background of legitimate business without drawing attention. Which, in Dante's experience, sometimes meant nothing, and sometimes meant everything. Clara came back with the result on the 3rd morning. The man in the photograph was named Gerald Marsh, Senior Operations Director at a Nashville-based firm that had been a regional partner of Meridian Group for several years before quietly dissolving 18 months ago. Current whereabouts unclear. Last known location, Nashville, Tennessee. Dante told Emily over the phone. She was packed and ready within the hour. Nashville was warmer than Chicago and moved at a different rhythm. Less sharp edges, more open space between things. They checked into a hotel near the downtown area and spent the first afternoon working through what they knew. Ethan had photographed with Marsh roughly 5 years ago, weeks before vanishing. Marsh had been connected to Meridian Group. The notebooks from the Milwaukee storage unit were full of financial notations that Emily had been working through carefully during the drive down, reading passages aloud when something stood out. The numbers didn't lie, but they didn't explain themselves either. Transactions moving between subsidiary companies in patterns that looked almost legitimate until you looked at the timing. Money arriving from one entity, sitting briefly in another, then dispersing outward in smaller amounts toward what appeared to be ordinary operating accounts. The kind of structure someone built specifically to make movement look routine. "He understood this," Emily said, sitting cross-legged on the hotel bed with 2 notebooks open in front of her. "Ethan studied accounting for 2 years before switching to logistics. He would have known exactly what he was looking at." "Which means he knew what he had was serious," Dante said. "And why he didn't just hand it to someone immediately," she added. "If the structure was this layered, he would have needed more than notebooks to make anyone act on it." The next morning, Dante tracked down the building where Marsh's former firm had operated. It was currently occupied by a different company, a small architecture practice that had moved in about a year ago. The receptionist was helpful in the vague way people are when they have no reason not to be. She confirmed the previous tenants had left without much notice and that some items had been left behind during the transition, eventually boxed and moved to a storage room downstairs. Dante explained they were looking for materials connected to an old business matter. The receptionist called her office manager. The office manager, after a brief conversation and a reasonable goodwill gesture from Dante, led them to a back storage room that smelled like old paper and disuse. Most of the boxes contained office supplies and outdated equipment, but on the bottom shelf near the back wall, behind a broken monitor and 2 empty filing boxes, was a slim, hard-covered journal with a rubber band around it. Emily picked it up. The rubber band snapped when she removed it, dried out and brittle from years of sitting in a storage room. Inside the front cover, in handwriting she clearly recognized immediately, were 3 words. In case. E. She sat down on the floor, right there between the shelves, and opened it. Dante stood beside her and read over her shoulder without comment. The journal was different from the notebooks in Milwaukee. The notebooks were data, names, figures, structural maps of money movement. This was more personal. Ethan's actual thoughts, written in the way a person writes when they're not sure anyone will read it, but they need to say it anyway. He had been in Nashville tracking Gerald Marsh specifically. He believed Marsh was the operational layer between Meridian Group's leadership and the accounts being used to move funds.
He had attended a regional business conference at a downtown hotel under his real name, which struck Dante as either brave or deliberate, and spent 2 days documenting what he observed, who spoke to whom, and which names kept appearing in the same conversations. Near the middle of the journal, one page was different from the rest. No notes, no figures, just a single line. Someone else is following this. I don't know if they're ahead of me or behind me. Either way, I need to move faster. Emily read that line twice without speaking. Dante straightened up and looked at the storage room around them with fresh eyes. The dust on most of the boxes was undisturbed and even, but on the shelf where the journal had been sitting, the dust pattern on either side of it was slightly irregular. A narrow gap where something had been recently removed and replaced. Someone had been here before them. Not long ago either. He said nothing to Emily immediately. She was still reading, working through the final pages of the journal, and he didn't want to pull her out of it before she finished. But the irregularity stayed with him on the drive back to the hotel. Ethan had written 5 years ago that someone else was following the same trail. Dante was now fairly certain that someone was still following it, and they were close. The first time they saw him, Dante thought nothing of it. A man sitting alone at a diner 2 blocks from the hotel, reading a newspaper with his coffee. Average height, early 40s, light brown jacket, the kind of person who blended into a room without trying. Dante clocked him the way he clocked everyone in any space he entered, quickly, instinctively, then moved on. The second time was outside the building where they had found the journal. Same man, different jacket, standing near the corner with his phone out like he was checking directions. Dante slowed his pace slightly, but kept walking. The third time settled it. They were at a coffee shop 2 miles from the hotel, going through the journal together and cross-referencing entries against the notebooks from Milwaukee. Emily had spread pages across the table and was working through a section that listed a series of company names in what appeared to be a deliberate sequence. Dante was watching the room while she worked, a habit that rarely switched off, and the man in the light brown jacket walked in, ordered at the counter without looking at them, and sat down 4 tables away facing the wall. Facing the wall, in a coffee shop with windows on 3 sides, meant he had chosen the one seat where he couldn't see the entrance, which meant he wasn't worried about who might come in. He already knew who was already there. Dante folded his copy of the notebook entries calmly and slid them into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Finish your coffee," he said to Emily quietly. She looked up, read his expression, closed the journal without asking why. They left through the side entrance. Dante took a route back toward the hotel that looped 2 extra blocks and doubled back once through a covered parking structure. The man didn't follow. That told Dante something too. Either he wasn't confident enough to trail them directly, or he didn't need to because he already knew where they were staying. Neither option was particularly comforting. Back at the hotel, Dante made a phone call. Within 40 minutes, he had a name. Ryan Brooks, 41 years old, originally from St. Louis. No criminal record, no corporate affiliations, currently listed as self-employed in vague enough terms that it told Dante very little about what he actually did. No connection to Meridian Group in anything publicly searchable. But there was a connection to Ethan Grant, a photograph on a social media account that hadn't been updated in 6 years. The 2 of them standing together outside what looked like a university building, both younger, both grinning like people who hadn't yet had a reason not to. Dante showed Emily the photograph on his phone. She leaned in and looked at it for a moment. "Ryan," she said immediately.
Ethan talked about him. They went to college together. He said Ryan was the most quietly stubborn person he had ever met, that once Ryan decided something mattered, nothing moved him off it. She paused. I never met him. Ethan said they'd drifted apart a couple of years before we got together.
Or he told you that to keep Ryan separate from everything else in his life, Dante said. Emily considered that.
You think Ethan was already being careful back then?
I think Ethan was careful for longer than either of us realized. Dante found Ryan Brooks the following morning. Not by searching, by simply going back to the same coffee shop at the same time and sitting down to wait. If Ryan was following their pattern, he would show up, and if he showed up, it meant he wanted to be found eventually. People who genuinely want to stay invisible don't appear 3 times in 2 days. Ryan walked in at 9:20. He stopped when he saw Dante sitting alone at a center table with 2 extra cups of coffee already poured. His expression shifted through several things quickly: surprise, calculation, then something that looked like quiet relief. He came over and sat down without being asked. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You found the journal, Ryan said finally. Yesterday, Dante said. Ryan wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at it. I've been 2 steps behind this whole trail for the last 4 months. I found the Milwaukee unit after the rental lapsed. Got there the same week it was flagged for auction clearance. Almost lost the whole thing, he exhaled. The Nashville journal I found 3 weeks ago, but someone had already been through the storage room before me. I thought I'd missed everything. You hadn't, Dante said. We have the notebooks and the journal. Ryan looked up. Who are you? Someone who met Ethan once and heard enough to stay curious. Dante paused. Emily Carter is with me. Something moved across Ryan's face at that, a complicated expression that carried weight behind it. How is she? He asked quietly. She spent 5 years not giving up on someone who didn't deserve to be given up on, Dante said. She's doing what that kind of person does. Ryan nodded slowly. Then he reached into the bag beside his chair and placed a sealed envelope on the table, thicker than the one from Milwaukee, with Ryan written on the front, in handwriting Dante now recognized immediately. Ethan mailed this to my mother's address 6 weeks after he disappeared, Ryan said. I didn't get it until 4 months ago when she passed and I was going through her things. He told her to hold it until someone came asking. He slid the envelope across the table. He told me in the letter that if the right people ever followed the trail far enough, I was supposed to stop running parallel to them and start moving with them. Dante picked up the envelope. There's more, Ryan said. The man in that photograph with Ethan, Gerald Marsh, I know where he went after the firm dissolved. Where? Dante said. Ryan looked at him steadily. Asheville, North Carolina, he said. And Ethan was there first. Asheville sat in a bowl of mountains that made everything feel slightly removed from the rest of the world. The drive-in from the highway dropped you through layers of elevation, the skyline replaced by tree lines, the flat Midwestern geography giving way to something older and less predictable. It was the kind of place that attracted people who wanted space between themselves and whatever they were thinking about. Dante could see why Ethan had chosen it. Ryan rode with them from Nashville, sitting in the back seat with Ethan's letter open on his knee for most of the drive, reading sections quietly and occasionally sharing something aloud when it connected to what they already knew. He had a methodical way of processing information, unhurried, thorough, and Dante found himself trusting the man's judgment more quickly than he usually trusted anyone. Emily sat in the passenger seat and watched the mountains come closer through the windshield without saying much. She had read Ryan's letter the previous evening in the hotel, sitting alone at the desk while Dante and Ryan worked through the Milwaukee notebooks at the table across the room. When she finished, she had folded it carefully and placed it in the front pocket of her bag, and she hadn't mentioned it since. Dante didn't ask. The key had been inside Ryan's envelope, a small brass key with a number stamped on the head. Not a storage unit this time, but a property key, with a handwritten address on a slip of paper folded around it. A cabin outside Asheville, purchased under a business name that Ryan had spent 2 weeks tracing back to Ethan through a chain of registered agents. The cabin was 20 minutes outside the city on a gravel road that climbed steadily through dense tree cover before leveling out at a small clearing. The structure itself was modest, timber frame, covered porch, functional rather than comfortable, the kind of place built for work rather than relaxation. The key fit the front door exactly. Inside, the air was stale but dry, which meant the structure was sound. The main room held a desk, 2 folding chairs, and a row of plastic bins along one wall, identical to the ones in Milwaukee.
A battery-powered lantern sat on the desk beside a folded note that read, "Check the bin marked 3 first." Ryan found bin 3 and opened it. Inside, packed carefully in bubble wrap, were 4 external hard drives and a compact battery-powered laptop, the kind designed for field use, built to hold a charge for extended periods. Beside the laptop was a handwritten instruction sheet explaining which drive to connect first and what the access password was. Emily sat down at the desk and powered the laptop on. It took a few minutes to cycle through. When the desktop loaded, a single folder sat in the center of the screen, labeled simply, "Watch these." Inside the folder were 12 video files, each one named with a date. Emily opened the first one. Ethan appeared on screen, looking thinner than the photographs, with the particular tiredness of someone running on purpose rather than rest. He was sitting at this same desk, in this same cabin, speaking directly to the camera with the calm of a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but meant every word of it. He explained everything from the beginning. 18 months before his disappearance, he had been working in logistics coordination for a supply company that contracted with several regional partners, one of which was an entity connected to Meridian Group. In reviewing shipping records for a routine audit, he found invoices that didn't match corresponding deliveries. Small discrepancies at first, easily explainable, but when he traced them backward, the discrepancies connected to a pattern of fund movement between subsidiary accounts that served no legitimate operational purpose. He kept watching the videos. So did Ryan. So did Dante.
Across 12 recordings made over a period of months, Ethan laid out a financial fraud operation with the patience of someone who knew he might never be in a room to explain it in person. Meridian Group's leadership had been systematically extracting funds from its regional partner companies by inflating service contracts, routing the difference through layered subsidiaries, and dispersing the money outward in amounts small enough to avoid automated flagging. The operation had been running for nearly a decade and had affected hundreds of small business partners and thousands of employees whose pension contributions and revenue shares had quietly been redirected. The final recording was different from the others. Ethan looked directly at the camera and spoke without notes. He said he had considered going to authorities immediately, but the fraud was structured in a way that would have allowed the leadership to dissolve the entities and walk away before any case could be built. He needed documentation at a scale that would close every exit before anyone knew the door was being shut. That required time. That required disappearing from his old life cleanly so that no one connected to Meridian would use the people he loved as leverage against him. He paused in the recording for a moment. Then he said, "Emily, if you're watching this, and I hope you are because it means someone followed this far enough, I need you to know that leaving was the hardest decision I ever made. I told myself I would come back when it was safe. I still intend to." Emily's hand went still on the desk. She didn't cry. She sat very straight in the chair and watched the screen until the recording ended and the room went quiet again. Ryan stood behind her with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, looking at the floor. Dante stood near the window and looked at the mountains through the glass, green and steady and completely indifferent to everything happening inside this cabin. After a long moment, Emily reached forward and opened the next file. She wasn't done yet. Neither were they. The last hard drive was different from the others. Where the first three contained financial records, documented evidence, and Ethan's video recordings, the fourth held something more current, files dated within the last 8 months. A secured folder that required a second password, which they found written on the back of the instruction sheet in smaller handwriting, as though Ethan had added it later as an afterthought or a contingency. Inside the folder was a single document, a consulting agreement between an individual named Edward Cole, a name none of them recognized immediately, and a financial recovery firm based in Denver, Colorado called Solvier Partners. The agreement was dated 14 months ago. The scope of work described in the document outlined assistance in building cases against entities engaged in structured financial fraud, specifically involving layered subsidiary accounts and inflated service contracts across multi-state business networks. Ryan read the description aloud and then stopped. He looked at Dante. Dante was already looking at him. "Edward Cole," Emily said quietly from the desk. She had pulled up a secondary file attached to the same folder, a scanned identification document. She turned the laptop screen toward them. The photograph on the identification was Ethan, older, slightly different in the way 5 years changes a person. The jaw a little sharper, the eyes carrying something they hadn't carried before, but unmistakably him. Emily stared at the screen for a moment without speaking. Then she closed the laptop gently, stood up from the desk, and walked out onto the cabin porch, alone. Dante let her go. Ryan sat down in the chair she had vacated and rubbed both hands over his face slowly. "He built a new identity to keep working," he said. "He didn't just disappear and stop. He disappeared and kept going under a different name." "It makes sense," Dante said. "If Meridian's leadership knew his real name was connected to the investigation, they would have found ways to make the evidence disappear along with him. A new name gave him room to keep building the case from a position they couldn't track." 5 years, Ryan said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the weight of it settling. "He thought he was protecting her," Dante said. "I know," Ryan said. "That doesn't make it simple." "No," Dante agreed. "It doesn't." They spent the rest of the afternoon working through the consulting documents carefully. What emerged was a clearer picture of what Ethan had been doing in the years since his disappearance. Solvier Partners was a legitimate operation. Dante had Clara run it through her channels while they worked, and it came back clean, with a track record of successful fraud recovery cases across several states. Ethan, working as Edward Cole, had spent the years since Milwaukee and Nashville compiling his evidence into a form that met the evidentiary standards required to actually build prosecutable cases. The fraud operation he had uncovered inside Meridian Group had already resulted in 3 civil recoveries and was currently part of an active federal investigation that had been running quietly for the past 11 months. Which meant the danger Ethan had been protecting Emily from was, by every indication in the documents, no longer active. The executives at the center of the Meridian operation had been systematically removed from their positions over the past year as the investigation tightened. The subsidiary structures had been dissolved. Gerald Marsh, the man in Paul Greer's photograph, had cooperated with investigators 18 months ago in exchange for reduced liability and had been living quietly under conditions Dante didn't need to read in detail to understand. Ethan had done what he set out to do, and now, apparently, he had left one final set of directions. They were in the last page of the consulting agreement, not part of the official document, but handwritten on the back of the final page in Ethan's handwriting, as though added personally after the typed agreement was finalized. A name, an address, a town 40 minutes outside Denver, and below the address, 4 words. "I've been waiting here." Emily came back inside from the porch as Ryan was reading the handwritten note aloud. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed loosely and listened to him finish. Then she walked to the desk and read it herself. She was quiet for a long time after that.
long enough that the light coming through the cabin windows shifted slightly as the afternoon moved.
"He left this for us to find," she said finally. "He left it for you," Ryan said gently. She looked at him. "Did you know? When you gave Dante the envelope in Nashville, did you know this is where it was heading?" Ryan shook his head. "I hoped, but I didn't know." She nodded slowly. Then she looked at Dante. He had been standing near the bins, giving the moment its space, and when she looked at him, he held her gaze without saying anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say. She wasn't looking for words. She was looking at someone she trusted enough to be honest with in a moment she hadn't fully processed yet. "I don't know how I feel," she said plainly. "You don't have to know right now," Dante said. "I've spent 5 years being certain about this," she said. "Certain he didn't leave, certain there was an explanation, certain that if I kept looking, I'd find the truth."
She paused. "Now I have the truth, and I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," Dante said. She looked at the address on the page one more time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her bag alongside Ryan's letter, alongside the photograph from Paul Greer's kitchen table, alongside everything she had been carrying for 5 years. "Denver tomorrow," she said. It wasn't a question. "Denver tomorrow," Dante said. The town was called Millbrook. It sat 40 minutes outside Denver in the kind of geography that made you understand why people chose it. Wide open, unhurried, the mountains visible in every direction like a permanent backdrop someone had hung there to remind you the world was larger than whatever you were carrying. They drove out from Denver in the morning. Ryan sat in the back again, quieter than usual. Nobody had slept particularly well. The hotel had been fine, but the night had been long in the way nights get when your mind refuses to slow down regardless of how tired your body is. Emily sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape open up around them as the highway thinned into a 2-lane road and the 2-lane road curved through scrub grass and scattered pine. Dante drove and said nothing. The address led them to a single-story house on a residential street that could have been in any quiet American town. Modest front yard, a truck parked in the driveway, curtains in the windows that suggested someone actually lived there rather than just existed there. A place that had been made into something deliberate over time. Emily asked Dante to stop the car half a block away. He pulled over without comment. She sat for a moment, looking at the house through the windshield. "I need to do this part alone," she said. Ryan leaned forward from the back seat. "Emily." "I know," she said. "I know you want to be there, but whatever happens when I walk up to that door, that's between me and him first. Everything else comes after." Ryan sat back. She looked at Dante. He nodded once. She got out of the car and walked down the street alone, her pace steady, her shoulders straight in a way that Dante had come to recognize as the particular posture she adopted when she was holding herself together through something that warranted falling apart. He watched her walk up the front path and knock on the door. A long moment passed. The door opened. Dante looked away. He and Ryan waited in the car for 20 minutes before Ryan got out and leaned against the hood without explanation. Dante got out too. They stood in the thin Colorado morning air and said very little. Ryan eventually spoke. "Do you think she's going to be all right?" "Yes," Dante said, without hesitation. Ryan glanced at him, took a moment before responding. "You care about her." It wasn't a question, and Dante didn't treat it like one. He just looked down the street toward the house and said nothing. Ryan nodded like that was answer enough and looked at the mountains. Emily was inside for an hour and 40 minutes. When she came out, she was alone. She pulled the front door closed behind her and stood on the porch for a moment before coming down the front path. Her expression was composed, not the forced composure of someone suppressing something, but the quieter kind that comes after something has actually resolved. She got into the car and sat for a moment before speaking. "He looks older," she said. "We both do, I suppose."
Neither Dante nor Ryan said anything.
He explained everything, all of it. The timing, the decisions, why he didn't find a way to contact me even once it became safer. She paused. He said he convinced himself that the longer he was gone, the more I would have moved forward.
That reaching out after 2 or 3 years would only pull me backward. She exhaled slowly. He wasn't wrong about some of it. He was wrong about the choice. How do you feel? Ryan asked quietly. Emily thought about it genuinely before answering, which Dante had noticed was something she always did. She never gave the reflexive answer.
Relieved, she said, and sad, both at the same time in a way that's hard to separate.
She looked out the window at the house.
He's not the same person. I'm not either. And the strange thing is, sitting there, talking to him, I could see exactly who he was and exactly who I am now. And those two people don't fit together the way we once did.
She turned back to face forward.
I spent 5 years looking for the man I lost. I found him. And in finding him, I understood that what I actually lost was a chapter, not a person.
The car was quiet for a moment.
Did you get what you needed?
Dante asked.
Yes, she said, and meant it completely.
She reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph from Paul Greer's kitchen table, Ethan and Gerald Marsh outside the gray lake house, and looked at it one final time. Then she placed it carefully in the center console, like setting something down that no longer needed to be carried.
He left something for you, she said to Ryan. He wants to see you before we leave Denver. He said there are things between the two of you that have nothing to do with any of this.
Ryan's jaw moved slightly. He nodded without speaking. Emily turned to Dante and looked at him with the directness she had shown since the first moment she stood at his table in Chicago and asked about a ring.
Thank you, she said, for all of it, for taking this seriously when you had every reason not to.
Dante looked at her. You would have found it eventually on your own.
Maybe, she said, but I found it faster with you.
He started the car. Outside the window, Millbrook sat quietly under the Colorado sky, indifferent and unhurried, the mountains holding their position in every direction. The chapter had closed, cleanly, without bitterness. And somewhere beneath the relief and the sadness Emily had named so precisely, something else was beginning. Something neither of them had planned for, and neither of them felt the need to name yet. The drive back to Denver was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the drive out. 3 weeks after Millbrook, Chicago looked exactly the same. That was the thing about cities. They didn't adjust themselves to accommodate whatever you had been through. The traffic on West Randolph was the same. The smell of the lake coming off the water on cool mornings was the same. The rhythm of the streets moved forward without caring that Emily Carter had driven through 4 states, found a man she had spent 5 years searching for, and come back carrying something entirely different from what she had left with. She had sublet her apartment while working extra shifts to fund the years of quiet searching, small trips, online records, dead ends that cost more than she could afford, but that she paid anyway because stopping felt worse than the expense. Now she was back in that apartment, the lease fully hers again, standing in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, making coffee, and noticing that the place felt different. Not smaller, just less weighted. Like a room after you've moved out furniture that was never quite right for the space. She had spoken to Ethan once since Millbrook. A short call, comfortable in the way conversations become when 2 people have said everything that actually needed saying, and what remains is just ordinary human decency. He was continuing his work with Solvere Partners under his real name now. The federal investigation had concluded its sensitive phase, and the need for Edward Cole had quietly ended. He was rebuilding carefully, on his own terms. He sounded, she told Ryan afterward, like someone who had found the version of himself he was always moving toward. Ryan had stayed in Denver for 4 days after the reunion. Whatever passed between him and Ethan during that time stayed between them, which was how it should have been.
He called Emily from the airport before his flight back to St. Louis, and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing consequential, which was its own kind of consequence, because it meant the friendship that Ethan had kept separate was now simply hers, too. She gained something she hadn't gone looking for. That seemed to be the theme of the whole thing. Caruso's was busier on Friday evenings than on weekday lunches.
Emily had been back at work for 2 weeks, and the Friday crowd required full attention. Larger tables, more complex orders, the particular energy of people who had been waiting all week for the permission to relax. She moved through the room with the efficiency she had developed over years of the job, carrying plates and reading tables and refilling water glasses without being asked. She was good at the work. She had always been good at it. But somewhere during the weeks in Milwaukee and Nashville and Asheville and Millbrook, something had shifted in how she thought about it. The work was fine. The work had kept her steady through 5 difficult years, but it wasn't where she was supposed to stay. She had started pulling out an old folder she kept in the bottom drawer of her desk at home. Plans she had written 3 years ago for a small catering business, detailed and researched, and then quietly shelved when the searching consumed everything else. She had spread the papers across her kitchen table last Sunday and sat with them for 2 hours, reading her own old thinking with fresh eyes. It was good. The plan was genuinely good. She had just stopped believing that. Dante came into Caruso's on a Friday evening, 3 weeks and 2 days after they had driven back from Denver together. He sat in the same corner booth. Emily noticed him from across the room, finished delivering a round of drinks to a table near the window, and came over with a coffee pot she hadn't been asked to bring. She poured him a cup and sat down across from him without waiting to be invited, which made him smile in a way she had learned meant he was genuinely amused rather than politely so. "How's the restaurant?" she asked. "The lighting above the bar is still wrong," he said. "I know. I reported it to the floor manager 2 days ago." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise. "You knew?" "That you owned it?"
I figured it out around Nashville. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup.
"The way you moved through the room when we first met, you weren't inspecting the service. You were inspecting your investment." Dante was quiet for a moment. "And you stayed anyway." "You were helping me find Ethan," she said simply. "Who you were outside of that wasn't my business until I decided it was." He looked at her steadily. "And now?" She considered the question with the same honest thoroughness she brought to everything. "Now, I think I'd like to know more about who you are outside of all of it, if that's something you're interested in." The restaurant moved around them, plates clearing, conversations overlapping, the particular comfortable noise of a room full of people who had nowhere else they needed to be. "I'm interested," Dante said. She nodded, no performance around it, no overstatement. Just 2 people sitting across from each other in a corner booth, both carrying the particular clarity that comes from having walked through something real together and arrived somewhere neither of them had planned for. "I'm also reopening a business plan I shelved 3 years ago," she said. "Catering, small scale to start." "Tell me about it," he said. So she did. She talked and he listened, actually listened, in the way she had noticed from the very beginning, the way that made you feel the words were landing somewhere rather than just passing through. The Friday crowd buzzed around them without intruding. The coffee stayed warm. The lighting above the bar remained wrong in a way that nobody fixed that evening because nobody was paying attention to it. Outside, Chicago moved the way it always did. But inside that corner booth, something was beginning. Quietly, without fanfare, on its own terms, the way the best things usually do.